Alarms tore through the training dome, and Lyra Cade's hands shook on the controls of a simulator that was about to fail her for the third time that week. Red light washed over her face. A voice from the control booth counted down the seconds until her simulated ship would be destroyed, and she could not find the sequence to save it. Sweat rolled down her neck. Around her, other cadets watched through the glass, some smirking, some looking away out of pity. She was 19 years old, ranked near the bottom of her class, and every day at Halgrave Academy felt like a test she was quietly failing. The simulator went dark. A flat, mechanical tone announced her defeat. Lyra sat still for a moment, breathing hard, before the hatch above her hissed open, and cold air rushed in. Instructor Callum Ashford stood at the top of the ladder, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "That is the third failure this week, Cadet Cade," he said. "Explain yourself." "I froze," she admitted. "I saw the incoming pattern, and I froze." He studied her for a long moment. "Freezing gets people killed. Out here, in real space, there is no second countdown." She climbed out without another word and walked past the row of watching cadets, her cheeks burning. Nadia Okafor, the top-ranked cadet in her cohort, caught her eye and gave a small, cool smile that was not quite unkind, but was not friendly either. Lyra had grown used to that look. She had grown used to being the cadet other people expected to wash out. Halgrave Academy sat on the edge of a quiet system, far from the busy trade routes and the wars fought closer to the galactic core. It trained pilots, engineers, and officers for a vast alliance of worlds, an alliance built from hundreds of species who had long ago agreed to share the stars in peace, or at least in careful truce. Lyra had grown up on one of the alliance's smaller colony worlds, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a shipping accident when she was small. She barely remembered them. What she did remember, in strange half-formed pieces, were dreams of a blue sky and a kind of gravity that felt heavier than anything she had known since. She had never told anyone about those dreams. They embarrassed her, the way old superstitions embarrass a person who wants to seem modern and capable. That evening she sat alone in the mess hall, long after the other cadets had gone, pushing food around her tray without much appetite. She kept replaying the simulation in her mind, trying to understand the moment her hands had stopped listening to her thoughts. "You always do this to yourself," said a voice, and she looked up to see Nadia sliding into the seat across from her, uninvited, but not unwelcome. "You replay the failure until you convince yourself you deserve it." "Maybe I do deserve it," Lyra said. "I'm not like you. I don't have your instincts." "You have something," Nadia said. "I've watched you in the medical simulations. Your calm is different there. It's just combat that rattles you." She paused, tilting her head. "Has anyone ever run a full scan on you?" "A deep one, not just the entry physical?" "Why would they?" Nadia shrugged. "No reason. You just move strange sometimes, like your body is stronger than it thinks it is." She stood, patted Lyra once on the shoulder, and left before Lyra could ask what she meant. Lyra sat with that comment long after Nadia had gone, turning it over the way she turned over most things that did not quite fit. She was used to small oddities about herself. Her body temperature ran slightly warmer than the Academy's medical charts expected. Her eyes adjusted to darkness faster than her roommates did. Once, during a strength assessment, she had lifted a training weight rated far above her expected class, and the instructor running the test had simply written it down without comment, as if such things happened all the time. She had learned not to ask questions about herself. Questions had a way of making people at the Academy uncomfortable, and discomfort had a way of following her afterward. Her room was small, shared with a quiet cadet named Priya Sundaram, who was already asleep by the time Lyra returned. Lyra lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of the Academy's environmental systems. Somewhere above the dome, real stars turned in a sky she rarely had time to look at. She thought about her grandmother, who used to tell her, half joking, that she came from people who had once flown between worlds without any of the modern navigation systems the Alliance now depended on. Lyra had always assumed it was a story meant to comfort a lonely child, nothing more. The next morning brought a different kind of test. Basic combat drills were held in an open field beyond the main Academy buildings, where cadets sparred under the watchful eyes of instructors, who graded not just skill but composure. Lyra was paired against a broad-shouldered cadet named Dorian Vance, who had 2 years of prior service before enrolling and treated the drills like a personal contest. "Try not to freeze this time," he said, not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the match would end. She did not answer. When the whistle sounded, something in her shifted. She was not thinking about the countdown from the simulator anymore. She was thinking only about the next half second, the placement of her feet, the angle of her arm. Dorian came at her fast, and for one strange moment, the world seemed to slow down around her, the way it sometimes did in her half-remembered dreams. She stepped aside from his strike with a smoothness that surprised her own body, and countered in a way that ended the match before the instructor had even finished shouting the rules reminder. Silence fell over the field. Dorian sat on the ground, blinking up at her, more startled than hurt. The instructor, a stern woman, named Commander Faye Whitcomb, walked over slowly, studying Lyra with new interest. "Where did you learn that movement?" she asked. "I don't know," Lyra said honestly. "It just happened." Commander Whitcomb did not smile, but something in her posture changed, a kind of alertness that had not been there a moment before. "Report to the medical wing after drills," she said. "Full physical evaluation. I want updated readings on file." Lyra nodded, though a small, uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She had spent her entire time at the academy trying to be unremarkable, trying to blend into the middle of every ranking list so that no one would look at her too closely. Now, in the space of one match, she had drawn exactly the kind of attention she had always avoided. The medical wing was cold and quiet, its walls lined with soft blue light. A technician ran her through the usual scans, then paused at one of the readouts, frowning at the screen, before glancing at Lyra, and then back at the numbers. "Everything all right?" Lyra asked. "Your bone density and muscle response don't quite match your file," the technician said carefully. "It's probably a calibration error. I'll flag it for review." Lyra left the medical wing with that uneasy feeling still sitting in her chest, though she told herself it was nothing, the kind of small inconsistency that happened in any large system managing thousands of cadets. She tried to push it aside as she crossed the courtyard toward her next class, the setting sun casting long shadows over the academy's white stone buildings. That was when the alarms began, low and steady at first, then rising into a full emergency signal that echoed across the entire campus. Cadets stopped where they stood. Instructors who had been walking calmly a moment before suddenly broke into a run toward the command tower. Over the general channel, a voice ordered an immediate lockdown, all cadets to their quarters, all non-essential personnel to remain indoors. Lyra's heart began to pound, not from fear exactly, but from a strange, sharp awareness that something had shifted in the world around her, something bigger than a simulator failure or a strange scan result. She turned toward the sound of distant engines, a deep, rolling roar unlike anything she had heard in her years at the academy, and for reasons she could not explain, she did not run for her quarters like the others. She ran toward the sound instead. The sky above the training fields had gone strange, streaked with a heat haze that had not been there minutes before. Security drones swept overhead in tight formation, and in the distance, past the outer wall of the academy, a bright light was falling from orbit, trailing smoke and fire as it cut a hard path toward the ground. Lyra stood frozen at the edge of the courtyard, watching it come down, feeling something she could not name settle over her, half fear and half a recognition she had no explanation for. Whatever was arriving, it was not part of any training exercise she had ever heard of. And somehow, without knowing why, she was certain that her ordinary, unremarkable life as a struggling cadet had just ended. The academy's outer alarms shifted into a new, harsher pattern, one Lyra had never heard used in any drill. Instructors who usually kept perfect composure were shouting orders across the courtyard, herding cadets toward the shelters with real urgency in their voices. Lyra felt a hand close around her arm and turned to find Nadia beside her, pulling her back from the open field. "Move," Nadia said. "That is not a scheduled arrival." "What is it?" "I don't know. But whatever it is, the entire security division is treating it like a threat." Nadia's eyes flicked toward the falling light, now close enough that its roar shook the ground beneath their boots. "And it's coming down inside the perimeter." Lyra let herself be pulled toward the shelter entrance, but she kept looking back over her shoulder, unable to look away from the streak of fire crossing the sky. Something about it pulled at her, in a way she did not understand. A feeling that sat just beneath conscious thought, like a word on the edge of memory, that refused to come forward. She did not know yet that the ship falling toward Halgrave Academy would change the shape of everything she believed about herself, but some quiet part of her already sensed that the ordinary cadet she had been that morning was not the person who would walk out of the shelter once the sky went quiet again. The ship hit the training field just past the outer wall, with a force that threw dust and torn grass high into the air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the security drones that had been circling overhead dropped into a tight ring around the wreck, weapon systems humming to life, while a column of armored response vehicles came tearing across the field from the Academy's security depot. Lyra watched from the shelter doorway, ignoring the instructor's order to get inside, her eyes fixed on the shape sitting in the smoking crater. It was not built like anything from the Alliance fleet. Its hull was blunt and heavy, dull gray beneath a layer of scorched black, without the smooth curved lines that every Alliance vessel shared. Where Alliance ships used soft glowing panels to mark their hatches and sensors, this vessel had none, only rows of small dark windows, and a single wide door, sealed shut along its underside. It looked old and new at the same time, a design that seemed to belong to no catalog Lyra had ever studied in her engineering classes. Cadet Cade, Commander Whitcomb's voice cut through the noise, sharp and close. Inside, now. Lyra obeyed this time, retreating into the crowded shelter, where dozens of other cadets sat pressed together along the walls, some scared, some simply confused, all of them talking at once about what they had glimpsed before the doors sealed. Nadia found a spot beside her and sat in silence, watching the shelter's small monitor screen, which showed only a looping message asking cadets to remain calm during the security response. "They're not telling us anything," Priya said from across the room, arms wrapped around her knees. "They never do," Nadia said quietly. "Not when it's something they didn't expect." Hours passed in the crowded shelter, the initial fear slowly settling into a tired, watchful boredom. Rumors moved through the room, the way rumors always did, growing stranger with each retelling. Some cadets said the ship carried Alliance defectors. Others said it was a weapons test gone wrong. One cadet, a nervous first-year named Oscar Lindgren, insisted he had heard from a friend in the security division that the ship had come from a quarantine zone so old that most star charts no longer marked it at all. Lyra said little through all of it, turning her attention inward instead, back to the strange pull she had felt watching the ship fall from the sky. She told herself it was only the shock of the moment, the kind of sensation anyone might feel watching something so unexpected and so close. But some part of her did not believe that explanation, and she could not shake the sense that whatever waited inside that ship was somehow connected to the quiet oddities she had spent her whole life trying to ignore about herself. Near midnight, the shelter doors finally opened, and cadets were released back to their quarters, under strict instructions, to remain inside until further notice. Lyra walked the long path back across the darkened courtyard with Nadia beside her, both of them glancing toward the sealed-off training field, where bright work lights now blazed around the crash site, and armed personnel stood in a wide perimeter no cadet was permitted to cross. "You should get some sleep," Nadia said, though she did not sound convinced Lyra would take the advice. "I will," Lyra lied. She did not sleep. She lay awake in her bunk, listening to the distant hum of machinery and the occasional pass of a security vehicle outside her window, until a knock came at her door, so quiet she almost missed it. She opened it to find Commander Whitcomb standing in the corridor, her expression unusually careful, almost gentle, in a way Lyra had never seen from her before. "Get dressed, Cadet Cade," she said. "You're wanted at the command tower." "By who?" "Someone from outside the academy." "Now, please, this isn't a request I have the authority to explain further." Lyra dressed quickly, her mind racing through every possible reason a mysterious visitor might want to speak with an unremarkable second-year cadet in the middle of the night, and coming up with nothing that made sense. She followed Commander Whitcomb through corridors that were unusually quiet, past checkpoints manned by security officers she did not recognize, officers whose uniforms carried no academy markings at all. The command tower's upper level had been cleared of its usual night staff. Only a handful of people remained inside a wide, softly lit room, dominated by a long viewing window that looked out over the sealed crash site. Admiral Garrick Sloan, the Academy's commandant, stood near the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, his face drawn and tired, in a way Lyra had never seen on the normally composed old officer. Beside him stood a woman Lyra did not recognize, dressed in a plain dark uniform without rank markings, her gray-streaked hair pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp and appraising as they settled on Lyra the moment she stepped into the room. "Cadet Cade," Admiral Sloan said, "thank you for coming. This is Director Petra Lindquist, of Alliance Intelligence." Lyra offered a stiff, uncertain salute. "Sir, ma'am, I don't understand why I'm here." Director Lindquist studied her for a long moment before speaking, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that made the room feel smaller. "How much do you know about your family history, Cadet Cade?" The question caught Lyra off guard. "Not much. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my grandmother." "And before your parents? Do you know where your family originally came from?" "A colony called Brenn's Reach. That's what my records say, anyway." Director Lindquist exchanged a brief glance with Admiral Sloan, one that carried an entire silent conversation Lyra could not follow. "Your records say a great many things that were arranged to say them, Cadet Cade," the director said. "I'm going to ask you to remain calm, because what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, and there is very little time to explain it gently." Lyra's stomach tightened. "All right." "The vessel that crashed on the training field tonight," Director Lindquist said, "carried survivors of a species the Alliance has kept under strict quarantine for more than 60 years. A species most of the galaxy believes to be extinct, or believes never truly existed outside of old rumors and border legends." She paused, watching Lyra's face carefully. "They are called humans, and we have strong reason to believe you are one of them, or descended very directly from them." The words did not make immediate sense to Lyra, the way a sentence in an unfamiliar language sometimes takes a moment to resolve into meaning. "That isn't possible," she said finally. "I grew up on Brenn's Reach. My grandmother, my parents, they were Alliance citizens." "Your grandmother," Director Lindquist said gently, "was part of a very small, very secret placement program, designed to hide surviving human children among Alliance colonies after the quarantine began. Brenn's Reach was chosen because it was remote, and because falsifying colonial records there was easier than in more populated systems. I am sorry to tell you this so suddenly, Cadet Cade, but the physical readings your medical evaluation flagged this afternoon match human physiology far more closely than they match any recognized Alliance species." Lyra felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her, though she had not moved at all. Why would anyone hide human children? Why would there even be a quarantine in the first place? Admiral Sloan finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Because 60 years ago, humanity was judged to be too dangerous to allow freely into Alliance space. There was a conflict, Cadet Cade, one that ended with Earth and its surviving colonies, placed under a total information blackout. Most people alive today have never even heard the word human spoken outside of old fiction and half-remembered stories. The Alliance decided it was safer, and perhaps kinder, to let humanity fade from memory than to explain what really happened. And now a ship full of them just landed on my training field," Lyra said, her voice barely steady. "Yes," Director Lindquist said. "Which means the quarantine has been broken, deliberately or otherwise, and every faction with an interest in humanity's fate will know about it within days, whether we announce it or not. That is why we need to understand exactly what connection you have to the people on that ship, Cadet Cade. Because if word spreads that a living, trained cadet with human ancestry is standing inside this academy, you will become a target for more than simple curiosity." Lyra looked between the two officers, her mind struggling to hold the shape of everything she had just been told. Somewhere beyond the tower's high window, past the sealed perimeter and the bright work lights, the crashed ship sat silent in the dark, holding inside it the answer to a question Lyra had never known to ask about herself. "I want to see them," she said, surprising herself with how steady her own voice sounded. "The people on that ship, I want to see them." Director Lindquist studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes. "That," she said, "can be arranged. But once you walk through that door, Cadet Cade, there will be no walking back to the life you had before tonight." Lyra thought of the simulator failures, the quiet years spent trying to disappear into the middle of every ranking list, the strange dreams of blue sky and heavy gravity she had never told anyone about. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel afraid of what came next. "I understand," she said. "Take me to them." A narrow elevator carried Lyra, Director Lindquist, and 2 silent security officers down through levels of the command tower Lyra had never known existed, past checkpoints that required hand scans and retinal verification, even for the director herself. The deeper they went, the quieter the corridors became, until the only sound was the soft hum of machinery and the steady rhythm of their own footsteps. "This facility was built decades ago," Director Lindquist explained as they walked, "in case the quarantine was ever compromised. Very few people at this academy even know it exists. Admiral Sloan is one of perhaps 6 officers in this entire sector cleared to access it." "And now I'm cleared too," Lyra said, still trying to make sense of how quickly her life had shifted shape. "For tonight, yes. What happens after depends on what we learn." They stopped at a heavy door marked with nothing but a plain numeral, and Director Lindquist pressed her palm against a scanner beside it. The door slid open onto a wide observation room, its far wall made entirely of reinforced glass looking into a sealed medical bay. Inside, under soft white light, lay 3 figures on separate examination beds, monitored by a small team of medical staff in full protective suits. Lyra's breath caught. The figures looked so much like her, and so much like every Alliance citizen she had ever known, that for a moment, she could not understand why they had been treated as such a dangerous secret. 2 men and 1 woman, all bearing the marks of a hard journey, bandages wrapped around visible wounds, their faces drawn with exhaustion even in unconsciousness. And yet, looking at them, Lyra felt something stir in her chest that she had no name for, a recognition that ran deeper than simple physical resemblance. "Are they going to be all right?" she asked. "The medical team believes so," Director Lindquist said. "Their injuries are serious, but survivable. The larger concern is what they represent, and what their arrival will set in motion." As if summoned by the words, one of the men stirred on his bed, his eyes opening slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in his surroundings. He was perhaps 30 years old, with short dark hair, and a jaw set tight, even in his weakened state. His eyes moved past the medical staff and found the observation window, found Lyra standing behind the glass, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of disbelief, mixed with something almost like hope. "Who is that?" he said, his voice rough, audible through a speaker beside the glass. "The girl. Who is she?" Director Lindquist stepped closer to the intercom panel. "My name is Director Lindquist. You're safe, for now, inside an Alliance medical facility. Can you tell me your name?" The man ignored the question, his gaze still fixed on Lyra. "Her eyes," he said. "That's a Cade family look if I've ever seen one. Where did you find her?" Lyra felt a chill move through her. "You know my name?" "I know the Cade name," the man said, struggling to push himself up onto his elbows, despite a nurse's protest. "There were Cades on the last transport out of the northern settlements, before everything fell apart. A family with 3 daughters. If you're one of theirs, then you're the first proof in 60 years that any of them survived. My name is Ethan Cole," he added, before anyone could stop him. "I was a pilot, before the world I grew up on stopped existing on any map your Alliance keeps, and unless I'm more wrong than I've ever been about anything, you are looking at family, whether either of us understands yet exactly how." The room seemed to tilt around Lyra for the second time that night. She gripped the edge of the observation console, her mind racing to hold together everything Ethan Cole's words implied. "My grandmother never mentioned any Cade family beyond herself and my parents," she said. "She told me we came from Bren's Reach. That was all." "Bren's Reach didn't exist before the placement program," Director Lindquist said quietly. "It's possible your grandmother believed the story herself, or was given only enough truth to protect the rest of it." Ethan laughed, a short, tired sound with no real humor in it. "That sounds about right. They didn't just hide us from the Alliance. They hid us from ourselves too, piece by piece, until nobody left standing knew the whole shape of what happened." He winced, pressing a hand against his ribs, as a nurse finally succeeded in easing him back down onto the bed. "How long has it been since the last transport left Earth orbit?" 62 years, Director Lindquist said. Something in Ethan's face went very still. 62 years, he repeated softly. We were only in transit 11, by our reckoning. Cryodrift, maybe, or something about the route we took. I don't know yet. He closed his eyes briefly. There were 4 transports that left together. We got separated during a pursuit not long after we launched. I don't know what happened to the others. Pursuit by whom? Lyra asked. Ethan opened his eyes again, and this time the look he gave her was heavier, more careful. You really don't know any of this, do you? None of it. Not the war, not why they quarantined us, none of it. No one does, Lyra said. Humans are barely more than a rumor where I come from. A story people tell to explain old ruins and border legends. Ethan let out a slow breath. Then I suppose someone owes you a very long explanation. But not tonight. Tonight I can barely keep my eyes open. And I imagine your director there has more urgent questions than history lessons. He looked to Director Lindquist. Where are the other transports? Truly, if any of them made it, if any of the northern settlements survived, I need to know. We don't have that information yet, Director Lindquist admitted. Your arrival here was completely unexpected. As far as any official alliance record shows, humanity has been extinct, or at minimum, entirely inaccessible, for over 5 decades. Extinct, Ethan repeated bitterly. Convenient word for people who wanted an excuse to stop looking. The tension in the room deepened, and Director Lindquist stepped back from the glass, turning her attention to Lyra instead. I think that's enough for tonight, Cadet Cade. The medical team needs to continue their work, and you need rest before what comes next. What does come next? Lyra asked. Tomorrow, this becomes a matter for the full Alliance Council, not just this Academy's leadership, Director Lindquist said. And once that happens, I no longer control who learns about you, or how quickly. I need you to understand that clearly. From this point forward, your safety cannot be guaranteed the way it was this morning. Lyra looked back through the glass one last time, at Ethan Cole's tired, watchful face, at the 2 unconscious figures beside him who might, for all she knew, share her blood as closely as he claimed to. The strange dreams of blue sky and heavy gravity that she had carried her whole life without explanation suddenly felt less like imagination, and more like memory, inherited from people she had never known existed. The walk back up through the tower felt longer than the walk down had. Admiral Sloan was waiting for them at the top level, his expression grim in the low light of the empty command room. Council session has been called for 0900, he said without preamble. Word is already moving faster than we hoped. A Tyrellan diplomatic ship requested emergency docking clearance an hour ago, citing, and I quote, matters of quarantine integrity. Director Lindquist's jaw tightened. The Tyrellans have no legitimate claim over a human survivor situation. They'll manufacture one if it suits them, Admiral Sloan said. You know how this works as well as I do. A confirmed human bloodline, especially a trained Alliance cadet, is worth more to certain factions than any trade agreement they could negotiate honestly. They'll want her identified, studied, possibly relocated under whatever legal framework they can construct in the next few hours. He glanced at Lyra with something that looked almost like an apology. I'm sorry, Cadet Cade. I did not expect this to move so quickly. Lyra stood very still, trying to absorb the sense that overnight she had gone from an unremarkable cadet worried about failing a simulation to the center of a dispute that involved entire governments. What happens to me if the council decides I belong to some other faction's jurisdiction? That, Director Lindquist said carefully, is precisely what I intend to prevent from happening. But I will not lie to you and tell you the outcome is certain. Politics rarely respects the wishes of the people it moves around, like pieces on a board. A quiet alarm chimed from a console near the window, and a junior officer hurried in, face pale. Director, Admiral, we have a situation at the perimeter. Someone attempted to access the crash site's data logs remotely, twice in the last 20 minutes. Security traced the first attempt to an Academy terminal. Which terminal? Admiral Sloan said sharply. The officer hesitated, glancing briefly at Lyra before answering. Instructor Callum Ashford's credentials, sir. The room went very quiet. Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach, thinking of the instructor who had failed her simulation only that morning, who had seemed, in his own gruff way, to care whether she succeeded or not. That can't be right, she said. He wouldn't. We don't yet know what it means, Director Lindquist said, though her tone had sharpened considerably. "It could be an authorized inquiry we simply haven't logged yet. It could be something far less innocent. Either way, it tells me this situation is already less contained than I hoped." She turned to Admiral Sloan. "I want every access log from the past 12 hours pulled and reviewed before the council session, and I want Cadet Cade moved to secure quarters within this facility, effective immediately." "You think I'm in danger from someone inside the academy?" Lyra said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "I think," Director Lindquist said, "that the moment a secret this large starts to come apart, it is very difficult to know who benefits from which piece of it. Trust, for now, has to be earned carefully, even among people you believed you already knew." She placed a hand briefly on Lyra's shoulder, an oddly gentle gesture from someone so composed. "Get some rest if you can, Cadet Cade. Tomorrow, the world you grew up believing in is going to change for a great many people, not only for you. It will help if you are steady when it does." Lyra nodded, though sleep felt like an impossible request. As she was led toward a small, windowless room deep inside the tower's secure levels, she found herself thinking not of the council session ahead, or even of Ethan Cole's startling recognition of her family name, but of Instructor Ashford's stern, unreadable face from that morning, and the uncomfortable new question of whether anyone at Halgrave Academy could still be trusted to see her simply as a struggling cadet, rather than as a secret worth stealing. Lyra woke to the sound of her secure room's door unlocking, though she had barely slept at all, her mind circling endlessly through everything she had learned in a single night. A young officer she did not recognize informed her that Director Lindquist required her presence immediately, ahead of the scheduled council session, and the urgency in his voice told her something had already gone wrong. She found Director Lindquist in a small side office near the command tower's central chamber, standing over a table covered in data slates, her face tight with barely controlled frustration. Admiral Sloan stood beside her, arms crossed, looking older than he had the night before. "What's happened?" Lyra asked. "Instructor Ashford has resigned his post, effective immediately, and left the academy grounds sometime before dawn," Director Lindquist said. "Security footage shows him departing through a maintenance corridor that isn't monitored by standard patrols, which suggests either significant planning or significant help." "He wouldn't do something like that," Lyra said, though even as she spoke the words, she remembered his data terminal being flagged the night before, and the certainty in her voice wavered. "Perhaps not willingly," Admiral Sloan said. "We're looking into whether he was compromised, threatened, or simply paid. None of the possibilities are comforting." "What does this have to do with me?" Lyra asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Director Lindquist held up a data slate showing a partial access log. "Before he left, Instructor Ashford pulled a complete copy of your academy file, including the flagged medical readings from your evaluation yesterday. If that information reaches any outside party before the council session begins, we lose whatever advantage we had in controlling how your situation is presented." She set the slate down. "I won't pretend this isn't a serious complication, Cadet Cade, but I need you focused, not frightened, for what happens next. Can you manage that?" Lyra thought of Ethan Cole's tired, hopeful eyes through the observation glass, of the strange dreams she had carried her whole life without understanding them, of the grandmother who had perhaps believed her own comforting stories about Bren's reach, even as she hid a far larger truth. "Yes," she said. "I can manage that." The council chamber, when Lyra finally entered it, flanked by Director Lindquist and Admiral Sloan, was larger and colder than she had expected. A wide circular room, ringed with seats for representatives of a dozen Alliance member species, each delegation marked by its own colors and insignia. Lyra had studied the council's structure in her academy classes, but seeing it in person, filled with sharp-eyed representatives already murmuring among themselves at the sight of her, made the abstract lesson suddenly, uncomfortably real. A tall, pale-skinned delegate near the center of the chamber rose first, his voice carrying easily across the room, without need of amplification. "I am Consul Draven Marsh, speaking for the Tyrellan Compact. We formally request custody of the human survivors, currently held at Halgrave Academy, along with any Alliance citizen confirmed to carry human ancestry, pending a full quarantine integrity review, under Compact jurisdiction." A ripple of murmurs moved through the chamber. Director Lindquist stepped forward before anyone else could respond. The Torellan Compact has no standing claim over Alliance citizens, Consul Marsh, regardless of ancestry. Cadet Cade was born and raised within Alliance territory, under Alliance protection, and remains an Alliance citizen in good standing. An Alliance citizen whose very existence was concealed from this council, for reasons never fully explained, Consul Marsh replied smoothly. One wonders what else has been concealed, and for how long, under the convenient excuse of quarantine security. Lyra stood very still at the center of the chamber's attention, forcing herself to breathe evenly, despite the weight of so many unfamiliar eyes studying her like a specimen rather than a person. She thought of Nadia's steady presence beside her in the shelter the night before, of Ethan Cole's blunt honesty through the observation glass, and found, unexpectedly, that the fear she had expected to feel was giving way to something closer to anger. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice cutting cleanly through the chamber's low murmur. Every head turned toward her. Director Lindquist hesitated only briefly, before giving a small nod of permission. "I didn't know any of this yesterday morning," Lyra said, addressing the full circle of delegates, rather than any single one. "I was a cadet, worried about failing a training simulation. I don't know the history you're all so eager to argue about, because it was kept from me, the same way it was kept from everyone I grew up with. But I do know this. I am not a piece of evidence to be transferred between jurisdictions, and I am not responsible for decisions made 60 years before I was born. If this council wants to debate the quarantine, debate it, but do it without treating me as property to be assigned to whichever delegation argues loudest." Silence followed her words, heavier and more attentive than the murmuring that had come before. Consul Marsh's expression flickered, something calculating passing behind his composed features, before he inclined his head slightly. "A fair point, Cadet Cade, and well spoken for someone only just learning the shape of her own history. Nonetheless, the Compact's concern remains valid. Quarantine breaches of this magnitude require independent verification, not simply the Alliance's own assurances." Another delegate rose, a broad-shouldered representative from a species Lyra did not immediately recognize, her voice deep and measured. "The Valari Concord supports independent review, but rejects any transfer of custody at this stage. We suggest instead a joint council oversight committee, drawing members from multiple delegations, to monitor the situation without removing Cadet Cade or the human survivors from Alliance protection." The debate continued for nearly an hour, delegates rising and speaking in turns, alliances of convenience forming and dissolving across the chamber, as different factions weighed the political value of humanity's sudden, unexpected return against the risks of appearing to endorse a decades-old cover-up. Lyra remained standing at the chamber's center throughout, exhausted but resolute, answering the occasional direct question with careful, honest brevity, refusing to be drawn into arguments that were not truly about her at all, but about the balance of power those arguments might shift. When the session finally recessed, Director Lindquist guided Lyra quickly out through a side corridor, away from the delegates now filing out to continue their negotiations in smaller, less formal settings. "You did well in there," she said, though her expression remained tense. "Better than well, honestly. But I won't pretend the outcome is decided. Consul Marsh doesn't give up positions that easily, and now that you've made yourself memorable, he'll be looking for other ways to pressure the situation." "What kind of pressure?" Lyra asked. Before Director Lindquist could answer, a security officer hurried toward them from the direction of the medical facility, his face urgent. "Director, you need to come immediately. There's been an incident with the human survivors." Lyra's stomach dropped. "Is Ethan all right?" "He's alive," the officer said, "but someone attempted to access the secure medical bay 20 minutes ago, using credentials that shouldn't have granted entry. Security intercepted the attempt, but not before the intruder disabled several monitoring systems." "Did you catch whoever it was?" Director Lindquist demanded, already moving quickly down the corridor. "No, ma'am. They escaped through the same maintenance route Instructor Ashford used last night." Lyra felt a cold certainty settle over her as she hurried alongside them. Whatever forces had begun moving, the moment that dropship crashed onto the training field, they were not content to wait for the Council's slow deliberations. Someone, whether connected to Consul Marsh's delegation, or acting entirely independently, wanted access to the human survivors, and by extension to her, badly enough to risk direct action inside a secured Alliance facility. They arrived at the medical bay to find it in controlled chaos, security personnel sweeping every corner, while medical staff worked to restore the disabled monitoring systems. Ethan Cole sat upright on his bed despite his injuries, alert and tense, his eyes finding Lyra immediately as she entered. "They came for the data logs first," he said without preamble. "Whoever it was. Not for us directly. Not yet. They wanted flight telemetry from the dropship, before we even woke up enough to answer questions properly." "Why would flight telemetry matter so much?" Lyra asked. "Because it would tell them exactly where we came from," Ethan said grimly. "Which means it would tell them where the other transports might be, if any of them survived. And that, Cadet Cade, is worth a great deal more to certain people than one confused pilot and a handful of survivors ever could be." Director Lindquist's expression had gone very still, the calculation behind her eyes visible even through her careful composure. "If someone believes there are more human transports out there, undiscovered," she said slowly, "then this is no longer only about quarantine politics. It's about who reaches those transports first, and what they intend to do once they find them." Lyra looked between Ethan's grim, weary face and Director Lindquist's sharpening resolve, and felt the last fragile pieces of her old, ordinary life finally settle into place behind her, replaced by something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined a single failed simulation could lead to. Security lockdown swept across Halgrave Academy within minutes, every corridor sealed, every exit monitored, while Director Lindquist's team worked to trace the intruder's escape route before the trail went cold. Lyra stood beside Ethan's bed, watching the controlled urgency around her, and felt a restless energy building in her own chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the sense that standing still was no longer an option. "You said the flight telemetry could reveal where the other transports might be," she said to Ethan. "Do you remember the route yourselves, even without the data logs?" Ethan studied her for a moment, something calculating behind his tired eyes. Pieces of it. Enough to be dangerous to the wrong people, if they got it out of me the wrong way. He glanced toward Director Lindquist. "Which is exactly why I haven't volunteered it freely to anyone yet, including your alliance." "You don't trust us," Lyra said. "I don't trust anyone who kept an entire species locked out of galactic memory for 60 years and called it mercy," Ethan said bluntly. "No offense intended toward you, Cadet Cade. You didn't make that choice. But trust isn't something I hand out easily anymore, not after everything my crew went through to get this far." Director Lindquist stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Cole, I understand your caution, but time is not a luxury any of us currently have. If someone inside or connected to this academy is willing to breach a secure medical facility for partial information, they will not hesitate to use far more aggressive methods once they realize the telemetry data itself may be recoverable elsewhere." "Recoverable how?" Lyra asked. "The dropship's black box recorder," Director Lindquist said. "If it survived the crash intact, it would hold a complete and far more detailed record than anything stored on our compromised systems. Whoever attempted to breach this facility tonight likely knows that as well as we do." A tense silence settled over the room. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, weighing something internally, before looking back at Lyra with an expression that had shifted, just slightly, toward something more open. "If I'm going to trust anyone with this," he said, "it's going to be someone with Cade blood, not a room full of officials who see me as a political problem to be managed. Get that recorder secured, and get me there, and I'll help however I can, but I want the cadet with me when it happens. Not shut safely away in some back room while decisions get made about my crew, without me in the conversation." Director Lindquist's jaw tightened, clearly unhappy with the demand, but after a long moment she nodded. "The crash site is still within the security perimeter. I can authorize a supervised visit, provided Cadet Cade is fully protected throughout." She turned to Lyra. "This is your choice, not an order. Given everything happening tonight, I would understand if you preferred to remain here, under guard, and let trained personnel handle the recovery." Lyra thought of the long, careful years she had spent trying to disappear into the safe, unremarkable middle of every ranking list, trying never to draw attention, never to risk failure where anyone important might notice. That version of herself felt impossibly distant now, separated not just by a single strange night, but by everything she had learned about who she actually was. "I want to go," she said. "Whatever this is, it started the moment that ship landed on my training field. I'm not going to sit safely out of the way while everyone else decides what happens next. The walk out to the crash site felt entirely different than it had the day before, when Lyra had only glimpsed the wreck from a distance through the chaos of the emergency lockdown. Now, under the harsh glow of security work lights, she could see the full scale of the ship up close, its hull scorched and dented, one entire section torn open, where the crash had breached the outer plating. Armed personnel stood watch around the perimeter, while a small technical team worked carefully near the ship's rear compartment, searching for the black box recorder buried somewhere within the tangled wreckage. Ethan, moving slowly and leaning on a support frame the medical team had insisted he use, guided them toward a section of the hull most of the security team had overlooked. The recorder isn't stored where Alliance ships keep theirs, he said. Our engineers built it into the reinforced spine, near the ship's center of mass, specifically because it's the section most likely to survive a hard landing intact. The technical team adjusted their search accordingly, and within 20 minutes, a small, heavily armored casing was carefully extracted from deep within the wreckage, its outer casing scorched, but its internal structure, according to the team's scans, remarkably intact. The moment the recorder was freed from the wreck, a sharp voice rang out across the crash site, distorted through an external speaker. Alliance personnel, stand down and surrender the recovered device. This site now falls under compact jurisdiction, per emergency provisions filed 1 hour ago. Lyra turned to see a small group of armed figures emerging from the darkness beyond the perimeter lights, moving with the disciplined precision of trained operatives rather than diplomats. Consul Marsh's forces, or someone working under similar authority, had not waited for the Council's slow deliberations to resolve in their favor. That is not a legitimate order, Director Lindquist called back, stepping forward with her hand raised toward the Alliance security officers around her, signaling caution rather than immediate confrontation. No emergency provision grants the compact operational authority inside Alliance Academy grounds. Filed and pending review is sufficient authority under interim quarantine statutes, the distorted voice replied. Surrender the device, and there will be no further incident tonight. The standoff stretched taut across the crash site, Alliance security officers and the unidentified armed group facing each other across a gap of perhaps 30 meters, weapons not yet raised but readiness clear in every posture. Lyra felt her pulse hammering, the strange calm slowness she had experienced during her combat drill the day before settling over her again, sharpening her focus even as fear tightened her chest. They won't actually risk open conflict on Alliance soil, Ethan murmured beside her, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. Would they? I don't know, Director Lindquist admitted quietly. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. Tonight, I'm no longer certain what anyone is willing to risk for a functioning human transport route. The tense silence broke suddenly as one of the armed figures shifted position, and an Alliance officer near Lyra reacted with a sharp warning shout, weapons rising on both sides in the space of a single heartbeat. Lyra's instincts, the same strange, sure instincts that had carried her through her combat drill without conscious thought, took over before her mind fully caught up, and she found herself moving, not away from the danger, but directly into the open space between the two groups, arms raised, voice carrying clear and steady across the tense field. Stop, she called out. Everyone, stop. For one terrible moment, nothing happened, and Lyra felt fully aware of how reckless her own choice had been, standing exposed between armed forces on both sides. Then, slowly, the raised weapons lowered, just slightly, uncertainty rippling through both groups, at the unexpected sight of an unarmed cadet, placing herself directly in the line of potential fire. You want proof of a human bloodline, Lyra called toward the armed figures beyond the perimeter lights. You're looking at it. If this becomes a fight, if anyone here starts shooting, whatever you're trying to recover gets damaged in the crossfire, and every delegation on that council chamber floor tomorrow will know exactly who fired the first shot on Alliance soil. Is that really worth it? For a data recorder you don't even know contains what you're hoping for? A long, uncertain pause followed. Finally, the distorted voice spoke again, quieter now, more measured. You have a point, Cadet Cade. This confrontation serves no one's interest tonight. The armed figures began withdrawing slowly into the darkness beyond the perimeter, weapons lowering fully as they retreated. But understand this. What you carry inside that ship's recorder will not remain secret for long, regardless of how this night ends. Other parties are already searching, with or without Alliance cooperation. The withdrawal left the crash site in a strange, uneasy quiet, broken only by the ordinary hum of the security team's equipment. Director Lindquist let out a slow breath, lowering her own raised hand, before turning to Lyra, with an expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "That," she said, "was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I have witnessed in 20 years of intelligence work, Cadet Cade. Possibly both." "It worked," Lyra said, though her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "This time," Director Lindquist said, "I doubt we'll be so fortunate every time going forward." Ethan approached slowly, studying Lyra with an expression that had shifted entirely from the guarded caution he had shown earlier. "You didn't hesitate," he said, "not for a second. Whatever else the Alliance stripped away from your family's history, Cadet, they didn't manage to take that." Back inside the secure medical facility, as the recovered black box recorder was carefully handed off to a specialized analysis team, Director Lindquist pulled Lyra aside into a quieter corridor, her expression unusually thoughtful. "The council session resumes in 6 hours," she said. "What happened tonight will already be part of the discussion, whether we choose to share it formally or not. Word travels quickly among delegations that keep informants everywhere." She paused. "I want to offer you a choice, Cadet Cade. One that I would not have imagined offering any cadet 24 hours ago." "What choice?" "You can return to your training as an ordinary cadet, so far as that remains possible now that your identity is known. The Council may still grant you standard protective status as an Alliance citizen, and in time, perhaps, this entire situation quiets into a historical footnote you simply carry with you." Director Lindquist paused again, studying Lyra carefully. "Or you can accept a different role. A liaison position, working directly alongside my division and whatever human survivors remain, helping navigate whatever comes next, whether that means locating additional transports, negotiating the terms of humanity's return to Alliance awareness, or simply serving as a bridge between two peoples who no longer understand each other at all. It would mean leaving behind the ordinary cadet path entirely. It would also mean far greater danger than anything you faced tonight." Lyra thought of the years she had spent trying to blend into the safe middle of every ranking list, the quiet oddities about herself she had learned to hide rather than question, the strange dreams of blue sky she had never understood until tonight. She thought of Ethan Cole's blunt honesty, of the 2 unconscious survivors still recovering in the medical bay who might, in time, tell her more about the family history that had been hidden from her for her entire life. She thought of the moment she had stepped between 2 armed forces without hesitation, some deep, inherited instinct guiding her forward, when every rational fear told her to stay back. "I'm done trying to disappear into the middle of every list," she said finally. "I want the liaison role, whatever comes with it." Director Lindquist studied her for a long moment, something that might have been respect settling into her sharp, careful expression. "Then welcome to a much larger and far more complicated fight, Cadet Cade. I hope, for both our sakes, that you're as ready for it as you looked out there on that crash site tonight." Dawn was breaking over Halgrave Academy by the time Lyra finally stepped outside again, the sky above the training fields shifting from deep night toward pale early light. The crashed ship still sat within its sealed perimeter, quiet now, its secrets partially recovered, many more still waiting to be uncovered in the days ahead. Somewhere inside the medical facility behind her, Ethan Cole and the other survivors slept under careful watch, carrying pieces of a history Lyra was only beginning to understand. Somewhere beyond the Academy's boundaries, delegations and hidden factions alike were already maneuvering for position, in a conflict that had, until yesterday, existed only as forgotten rumor. Lyra stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the sun rise fully over the fields where she had once struggled through simple training exercises, worried only about her ranking among a few hundred fellow cadets. That version of her life felt impossibly small now, viewed from the other side of a single, unforgettable night. She did not know exactly what challenges waited ahead, whether more transports would be found, whether the Council would ultimately protect her, or simply use her as a political tool, whether Instructor Ashford's disappearance would ever be fully explained. But she knew, standing there in the quiet gold light of a new morning, that she was no longer simply another cadet, unremarkable, and easily overlooked. She was something else now, something the galaxy had spent 60 years trying to forget existed at all. and for the first time in her life, she intended to make certain nobody looked away again.